When you got there, the first thing you meet is Cerberus, this three-headed guard dog at the door to the underworld. You went by, because you were a dead man, you were allowed in. If you tried to get in as a live man, you were eaten alive by this thing.
In Homer's account, Hades was a grim and dreadful place, so bleak that no temple for Hades exists anywhere. A place where the human spirit suffered an eternity of empty dreams.
Hades is terrible and inexorable, but he is not the punisher of souls like Satan in Christianity. Psyche in Greek means breath, comes from a verb psychein, which is to breathe. Now, when someone dies, he no longer breathes. Psyche has really been translated as soul. Now, psyches in the underworld have no consciousness.
There were two levels to the underworld. The first, called Erebus, was where the human soul passed immediately after death. The second was a deeper and more terrible place, called Tartarus. Those unrepentant and violent souls who had offended the gods were banished to Tartarus.
One of the most famous characters who was put into Tartarus was a fellow named Tantalus. And Tantalus was made to stand in a river with a fruit tree over his head. And he was eternally thirsty and eternally hungry, because whenever he reached to drink out of the river, the water would flow through his hands and he couldn't get it to his mouth. And when he reached for the fruit of the tree over his head, it would always move just out of reach. And so he was eternally tantalized, as we have the word from it now.
The gods and their stories gave meaning to the different cycles of life, and even the possibility of an afterlife. They also helped the Greeks establish a morality and a body of ethics. In ancient Greece, one of the most advanced civilizations of its time, these stories eventually inspired the birth of a new art form: the theatre. Later playwrights such as Euripides, Sophocles and Aristophanes dramatized them, allowing the epic tales to come to life for people throughout the centuries.
The relation of literature to myth and religious belief among the Greeks is a very complicated one. You have to remember that for them, literature, poetry especially, was not the preserve of an educated elite. It was not even originally meant to be read. It was publicly performed. It was accessible to everyone.
They had various kinds of performances. They had oral poetry, choral dancing, drama, but they would never think of it as something like one category, and especially they would never think of reading this material. You had it performed. And therefore it's much more deeply embedded in the local culture. It's not something that only a few people do, read these works. It's something that everybody hears and sees.
Some of the early authors crafted their plays and poetry around themes which were critical of the gods, something which later philosophers vehemently condemned.
Plato's criticism of traditional literature and of the stories in them was that the gods essentially didn't act like gods. I think Plato especially was very uncomfortable with that because of his own notion of what a god ought to be. You can see some of the same critique in Euripides, in his tragedies, his sense that, you know, gods shouldn't really act the way that a lot of the myths he's treating dramatically show them.
Certainly when you look at a drama like the Ion, in which Apollo is represented as a rapist, you begin to question the value of a god like that.
Some philosophers believed that redemption was the moral of the story. By the end of the play, the woman who was raped becomes the mother of Apollo's son, Ion, who went on to become the leader of the city-state of Athens. Many of the plays reflected the more tempestuous side of human nature in the conduct of the gods. Sexuality and affairs of the heart were controlled by Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, love, and fertility. Like Apollo, Aphrodite lived a turbulent life.
Aphrodite was connected with warfare through her union, her affair with Ares, the god of war. And they were two famous lovers. Aphrodite wasn't actually married to Ares. She was married to Hephaestus, or Vulcan, the god of the forge. But she had this flaming affair with Ares, the war god. And the question is, why are these two always getting together? It's the fury of their mutual passions which made them two gods that were beyond the control of all the other gods. And as the saying goes, you know, that every lover is a soldier on a campaign.
Early Greek writings conveyed life's everyday lessons. And yet, some of the works reflected a blatantly sexist attitude towards women. One example is the story of Hippolytus.
He despised women, he despised female sexuality, he was chaste, pure. We'd send him to a psychiatrist, but pure as the snow. His stepmother's nurse, handmaid, went to Hippolytus and told Hippolytus that his stepmother was in love with him. Hippolytus was appalled. He was horrified.
When Greek men got together at the drinking parties, at the symposia, we know that they told stories, that they produced poetry, which made fun of women. In early Greek culture, women were seen as consumers of men's effort. The man had to farm, the woman simply consumed the effort, stayed at home, cooked, and was always on the man's back. And there's a strong misogynistic strain in Greek literature all the way through the 5th and the 4th century.
Great dramas and comedies unfolded in amphitheaters throughout the land, with all male casts playing the roles of gods as well as goddesses, mortal men as well as women. But the Greeks were not the only ones absorbed by stories of deities and heroes. Far to the west, across the Mediterranean, a great new empire was emerging. The shadow of mighty Rome was about to fall on ancient Greece. Like classical Greece itself, the Greek gods and goddesses would also be eroded by the ravages of time and change. But they have not completely disappeared.
Even though they're not part of our religion, we still need these stories. They're wonderful, rich, richly suggestive tales about how the world works and what we are as human beings. Generation after generation of modern students love and are fascinated by these myths. And I think that springs from something we all have in us, which is a desire to make stories, a need to understand the world by making stories about it.
Greek mythology has transcended the centuries, coming down to us not only from the great poets and playwrights, but through the conduits of many other cultures. One of the first was Rome, far to the west, absorbing much of what Greece had to offer.
The Romans discovered Greek religion